Good morning, everyone, and welcome this very lovely morning to our first in the series of GovNet cybersecurity webinars ahead of our cybersecurity conference later on in October. We'll talk more about that at the end of the webinar. So I'd like to say firstly thank you to our speakers, Dan and Mike from techUK and NCA. Before I hand over to Dan, I would like to just mention a couple of things. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a couple of functionalities, including Q&As and chat. So if you could send your questions, anything that you've got that you want our speakers to answer, please do send that through the Q&A button at the bottom. And just to our speakers as well, just to be mindful of when you're speaking that you're on or off mute. So we've had a lot of challenges with our mute button. So there will be time at the end to kind of address the question specifically, but without further delay, I'd like to kind of hand over to Dan to get us started. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Antonia. Good morning, everyone. My name's Dan Patefield, and I lead the cybersecurity program at techUK, which is the industry body that represents the tech and digital sector in the UK. So it's a membership organisation with members ranging from your big tech behemoths like your BTs and Facebooks right down to the smallest innovators and SMEs. I wanted to start today by mainly focusing on a positive note, really, and looking at the successes that we've seen in the last few months. Clearly, the question that we're addressing today, how is the public sector staying cyber secure while working from home? That's only half the question. Obviously, it's not just the public sector; it's everyone. So we've all faced these challenges individually and as organisations. And I think that as a cyber security sector, we've responded to those quite well, and I'll tell you a bit about why. The first thing is obviously the resilience that's been shown by everyone in the move to home working. I'm sat miles away from my office now, but for much of the pandemic, I was sat 300 miles away in the northeast. And I think that physical distance between the office and its employees is a really key challenge that we've all seen face. I don't know about anyone else, but I'm always asking IT, stupid questions that takes them 30 seconds, but seems like a massive challenge for me. So I think that the work that's gone on so quickly to develop, processes around, conferencing and maintaining the strengthened sector that I'll touch on a little bit later. We've also seen obviously the threat landscape change, and I'm sure that we'll talk about that shortly with Mike. And particularly the uptick in nefarious activity like phishing's been there for all to see. That those phishing emails have got better even over the last 3 months. They've become harder to spot, and I imagine a little bit more effective in some cases. So the work that industry's done in kind of highlighting that's been really useful, but also what NCSC have been doing in this space. So NCSC have done some really good work in getting the phishing hotline and email a quick response as it's had to be over in the last kind of few months. We've also seen industry come together on other topics. So I've been involved in some initiatives to get some free tools from industry in the hands of people that need it, especially in the healthcare sectors and across government. And we've also seen offers around free cybersecurity skills content for those people that are on furlough and who are there's likely to be more people unemployed over the next few months. So I think these are just two examples of some successes we've seen in this kind of weird period. But I think that success has been built on over a number of years by a really strong public-private partnership. Government and industry working together across the initiatives covered by the National Cybersecurity Strategy, but more widely on specific issues like active cyber defence and the skills shortfall more generally. And I think that that is going to be a real kind of key pillar of the strength that we're going to have to show as even more COVID-19 fallout. Specifically here, I'm talking about the vast economic uncertainty that we're all facing. That poses a particular threat, and those organisations that are heavily focused on R&D funding and things like that. And I think that's a key risk for the sector going forwards, because the UK, in my opinion, is a leading cyber nation, up there with the kind of US's and the Israels of the world, and that's in part because of a strong innovation ecosystem that we've fostered over a number of years. Really got to protect going forward, and it's those companies that are facing that economic uncertainty hardest. And then the other challenge is, as it's been for a decade or so, it's the skills piece. I like to look at the skills piece in two separate columns, really. Awareness. Everyone needs awareness now. To a certain extent, we're all techies now working from home. And employee, no matter what their function or role is, needs to see, and companies need to be helping their employees understand those risks. And I think that the key to that is grounding it in how it can positively affect their personal lives as well, because obviously hackers don't care about whether it's a personal email address or a professional email address. So giving people that awareness is beneficial to them, and I think that's how we've got to ground it going forward. Then we've also got the obvious shortfall in actual skills, so deep technical, not necessarily deep technical skills, but technical skills for specific cyber roles, and that's something we've been struggling for as long as I can remember in the sector. The skills piece isn't helped by the diversity piece. We saw yesterday NCSC and KPMG release a report around decrypting diversity in the sector, and it paints a pretty bleak picture in terms of how we approach getting people interested from underrepresented groups. Gender diversity has always been a challenge. We see a real challenge in BAME, and also neurodiversity, which is really important for cyber. And I think that if you're not attracting over half of the population to cybersecurity roles, then you've already failed. So I think that that's a key area where we all need to do better. And all this kind of leads up to what we expect to be a change in threat landscape. I'm sure Mike's going to touch on this more effectively than me, but we're seeing not just in terms of criminal activity, but we're seeing a change in international landscape, and that's going to mean changes to how companies work within the UK, what you can do. Obviously, Brexit's going to re-emerge in the next few months as another issue to contend with, and the working from home trend isn't going to go away. It's going to be, we're not moving. I really hate the phrase new normal, but I don't think we're moving into, I don't think we're at new normal yet. We're at a place where we're waiting for the next change, and what we end up with is probably going to be a kind of a hybrid working model where we work half the time from home and half the time in the office, and that presents other challenges for the threat surface and what that looks like for organisations, both in the public sector and in industry. So I think I'll leave that there, but I'm sure that that's going to be one of the areas where we touch on in the later conversation. And with that, I'll hand over to Mike Hulett from the NCA.
Okay, thanks very much, Dan, and thanks right from the start to GovNet Events for asking me on this morning. I'm delighted to assist and very happy to meet you all virtually at least. So so my name's Mike Hulett. I'm senior leader in the National Crime Agency from the National Cybercrime Unit. My actual job title is Head of Technology and Capabilities, but don't mistake that for an in-depth IT understanding. I always get slightly nervous when I see an attendee list and lots of heads of IT and so on there who probably know more than me about certain IT aspects, but yeah, hopefully I'll have something to add from the criminal side. So I thought what I'd do to start with is just touch a little bit on obviously what's happened over the last 3 or 4 months. So what has changed in the cyber threat landscape? Look a little bit at the security implications of remote working, and what the future might look like. How have the criminals adapted, and what do we all collectively need to think about in that IT security space as we go forwards? So a little bit to start with then around the threats. So I've often looked at this, and we've talked to we talked to other threat areas within serious organised crime, and if we think what happened back in March, lockdown came around pretty quick. So for other serious organised criminals, they had to really adapt what they were doing. So if you were a drug trafficker, for example, all of a sudden people aren't moving in and out of the country. There's not much freight moving around. It's harder to get your stuff around. There's pretty much a stay-at-home mandate. So people looking to deal on the streets, all of a sudden you need a plausible reason for being outside, and so on and so forth. But when you think about our cyber criminals, these guys have been doing it for years. They've got this remote working down to a T. It's not really a change for them. It's us that have had to adapt far more than them, and that gives them their first real lever, their first real in. You've got a whole load of concern, public concern, organisational concern. What's going on? What does this mean for the economy, and so on. All of that is ripe fishing ground for the criminals with multiple social engineering opportunities, and we've certainly seen that. So Dan mentioned, for example, the increase in scam and phishing sites. Thankfully, some of those have died off recently with some really good work done by the NCSC. But think back in the early days of lockdown, it seemed everyone was selling testing kits, everyone was selling PPE when there was a shortage of it. Much of that was just ordinary fraud and scams, if I can put it that way. And we know that the criminals will prey on the latest media concern of the day, whether that's an organisation having a cyber attack quite publicly, and everyone will jump on the back of that and pretend to be part of the IT security department. We've seen all this kind of stuff before, but here we've got it in spades, and it's a much bigger thing with a much bigger opportunity. So there were certainly multiple opportunities for social engineering, which continue really to an extent. Dan's mentioned as well, I think the research and development side, and this is key because there's a lot of lucrative targets out there for organisations. People will have seen media reporting last week where the government has publicly pointed the finger towards Russia in terms of trying to steal intellectual property, in particular targeting towards vaccine cures and so on. You think about it, anyone who's actually having the identifying a cure for COVID at the moment, that's a pretty valuable piece of intellectual property to all sorts. And so organisations involved in that research and that development need more protection than ever. There's another kind of threat change that perhaps isn't obvious, and that's and for us it comes with what I call lots of idle hands. So all of a sudden at the end of March, we've got a whole bunch of people suddenly sent home. Many of them are tech savvy, and included in that are a whole bunch of students who are no longer at university, no longer at school. And of course, the cyber problem is much wider than just students. But as I say, we've got lots of idle hands sat there, and in some cases they haven't been put to good use. So all of a sudden there's lots more people that could be involved that perhaps ordinarily don't have the time, but all of a sudden they do. So the threat certainly changed, and it's continuing to this day, with one of the priorities being the research and development and how do we keep that secure. So, what were the security implications then? And some of these have mitigated themselves, I guess, with the passage of time and organisations getting more up to speed and more used to the concept of remote working. But effectively, if we think back to the end of March, an awful lot of organisations were simply not ready. They didn't have a policy for remote working. They didn't really know where they stood in terms of a bring your own device culture, what that might mean, how that affected identity and access management, for example. All of a sudden, they're desperate to try and keep on working, and admirably so. But cybersecurity perhaps wasn't the foremost thing in their mind when organisations are facing their very existence going down. That's their first concern is keeping the business going, and information security, cybersecurity is almost a secondary issue. Again, that in itself creates some a fertile hunting ground for the criminals. So we've got everyone's familiar with business continuity planning and sort of disaster recovery and so on. But I speak from personal experience here. We have our own in the SCA and National Cybercrime Unit. We have our own business continuity plan, but we sort of suddenly realised that most of that is based on the traditional sort of physical events that might happen. So there's some whether it's a fire or a flood or whatever, but something that makes your ordinary building inaccessible. Well, most people have got a BCP that allows you to recover to an alternative site in some form or another. But the vast majority of organisations didn't have a BCP which catered for everyone being unavailable at the same time. So normally you'd think another unit could do it, or another organisation could take over your responsibilities for a while. All of a sudden, when nobody's available, we didn't have a solution. So again, we've had to think on our feet a little bit, and that's created some opportunities. So we've got, there's some really basic things when it comes to remote working that perhaps we don't think about. Sometimes there is a really technical solution to it, and there's lots of vendors out there who I'm sure are doing some really good work and providing solutions. But there's some really basic things organisations need to think of, be they private sector or public sector. So for a start, if you have a whole bunch of people working remotely, there's whether that's working remotely or working at home, and I think we need to remember there's sometimes a difference. You might be assuming that your staff are at home. How do you know, for example, that they're not sat down the local cafe? Well, for the first few months of lockdown, of course, we were fairly happy that they weren't, because the cafe was shut. But are we so sure anymore? So what are the VPN implications there? But there's quite simply, if you've got more IT assets outside of the office, you have an increased risk of loss of those assets. How do you go about ensuring those? Maybe companies have relaxed or changed their policies around bring your own device. Well, how do you know that personally owned device is patched, is encrypted? You have much less control over that as an endpoint as you would if it was a corporate asset. And I think something that's often overlooked as well in terms of that remote working is I call it the human factor, and this this manifests itself in a number of different ways. So again, speaking from personal experience, we've done an awful lot of video conferencing. We are heavy users of Zoom. I think it works quite well and it's quite effective, but there's multiple other tools out there that do the same thing. So in terms of keeping in touch with teams and being able to remotely work, I've been quite surprised. But what you miss out on is that that immediately sitting next to someone. So think of it this: someone receives what is a phishing email, perhaps in an ordinary environment, back pre-March, someone might have just had to sit to a colleague sat next to them. Oh, I've just received this. What do you think? And that was it was a very quick conversation, and it was yeah, it looks a bit odd. Why don't you speak to the security people? Well, you don't have someone alongside you anymore, so some of that immediate peer support is gone. And I think from the criminal perspective as well, what we're also seeing is the rise of the insider threat. Again, this comes under my sort of general heading of the human factor, where ordinarily for most organisations, people assume that there's a level of network monitoring, a level of business monitoring, and that in itself is an effective deterrent and control against potential malicious activity from inside an organisation. But perhaps people are assuming that if they're working remotely, those network controls, that monitoring control is no longer in place, and therefore there's an increased opportunity for insiders to be carrying out activity remotely. That manifests itself in all sorts of different ways, of course, but there is a risk there. I think back to again under my general heading of the human factor, just general HR practices. These are more difficult when we're working remotely. I did an internal event last week where we're as an organisation we're continually growing. We've been recruiting quite heavily in the last year or so. So despite lockdown, we've had quite a few new joiners come to our organisation in the last 3 months. These are people that we've never physically met, so we're trying to onboard them. We're trying to get them used to working in the organisation. All of this being done remotely, so some of those normal security controls and personnel controls and so on that we would have in place, they're a bit harder to apply in remote working and so on. So all of these are things that we've had to get used to over the last couple of months. And as Dan rightly said, I don't think we're in the new normal yet, and these are things that are likely to carry on with us for quite some time to come. So I'll pause there for a moment, because I know there's some questions that are coming from the audience that we'll crack on with answering. But hopefully that gives a little bit of a flavour of some of the changes in the cyber threat as we see it. So in some ways, I think the criminals were ahead of the game. They were very used to this remote working. They didn't have to change as much in the cyber area as perhaps other organised criminals did. But on the organisational side, I think it's fair to say that most people weren't ready. Nobody expected this kind of thing to happen. Hopefully we're a lot more ready now, but that in some cases has allowed for increased risk areas and increased opportunities for criminals. So I'm going to pause there and turn to I think there's some questions that have come through from the audience. I'll just look at these.
Just before we jump into those, Mike, I just wanted to kind of pick up on a couple of points you made, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So the human factor is something that we are always looking at as well, and I think there's always been this kind of talk around how people are your greatest vulnerability, but also your greatest defender at the same time. I think that's probably still true. I think we do work in a sector that's got a lot of marketing noise around it in terms of technical solutions, and anyone offering a technological silver bullet in cyber's talking rubbish. The technology's there as a tool to be used by people, and for them to do that effectively, they've got to understand it. And I suppose that kind of brings me on to the question I had really around how, as we've all moved to working from home and working through Teams and Zoom and all the other ones, do you think that we've gone so quickly that cybersecurity is now coming back, and we've got to take another look and think, actually, we might have done this a bit backwards, and we need to, because I spend a lot of my time talking about secure by design, but overnight we have to carry on the business. We have to get going in terms of home working. So we've probably done some of this in reverse. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, and there's a couple of points I think to add into that. Again, from looking at an SME perspective and so on, when many of them were literally faced with going to the wall, they've had to very quickly adapt their business, and so one of the things that we noticed is things like food delivery services. Just I'll pluck that out as an example. So organisations that never previously had an online presence, they existed as a restaurant or whatever, but in an effort to continue trading, and hats off to them for trying, they've suddenly gone into the food delivery business and doing takeaways and so on. oftentimes with a fairly hasty setup, if I'm honest. So that desire to keep the business going and so on overrode any concept of securing the system beforehand and testing it and so on. Time simply didn't allow for the norms that we would expect in rolling out some kind of web platform for your business. So again, there's conscious all this sounds a bit doom and gloom, and it shouldn't be, because I think there's been some great innovation out there for companies that have changed what their normal way of working, and in an attempt to carry on. But we shouldn't ignore the potential risks that go with it. But you're right, some of that secure design has potentially gone out the window. We've had to bypass that, or organisations have had to bypass that, just in an attempt to carry on and diversify what they're doing, which potentially causes some risk. So I'm going to I'll pick up, if I can, on a couple of the questions. I know some questions have been sent in advance, and I'd encourage all listeners, if you do have questions, please do put them in on the Q&A part, and Dan and I will do our best to answer them. So there's a question that's coming around cyber security insurance. Is it worthy of consideration? Is it value for money? Is it money better spent elsewhere? Well, to be honest, I think you could write a thesis on that question, and I'll be really careful here that I don't make either overly glowing or overly disparaging comments about what is a whole industry, and it's quite a complex topic. But there's some interesting research around looking at the whole concept of insurance, and generally speaking, every company will have their fire and flood insurance, or their terrorist attack insurance, whatever it might be. How many of them actually have cyber insurance? And you compare that to the likelihood of any of those events actually happening. Unfortunately, a cyber incident of some sort is far more likely. Yet it's one of the least likely to be insured against. As a general comment, I'd say absolutely yes. Anything which provides a specialist service and a level of support for a business is worthy of consideration. I would add a caveat to that, though, and this is, as I say, not me being disparaging about the industry, but be careful what it is that you're actually buying, and what your insurance might actually be covering. I think back to a particularly large company, that's an insurance company, that had a strap line on a advertising campaign a couple of years back now, and the strap line was along the lines, and I saw this every day when I got on the tube, and it made me chuckle, but the strap line was along the lines of we will recover your stolen data. I look at that and think, really, will you? I think what they actually mean is we will do our best to restore your systems to the state they were at the point you were attacked. Because I think sometimes there's what I mean by that is stolen data is clearly a huge issue in cyber. It's one of the most prevalent attacks that we see. Data is valuable. You don't need me to tell you that, but from an investigation perspective, yes, we would always hope to be able to hunt down where that data might have gone. But what we can never assure anybody about is whether it's been copied, and we'll see. Can you ever really take a criminal's word for it? They've deleted it. What if you pay a ransom, for example? So for us, from a basic law enforcement perspective, it's not the same as recovering a stolen work of art or a stolen car, for example. Once you've got it back, you've got it back. From a data integrity perspective, even if we can find data that's been stolen, our advice will be is to only ever assume that is a copy of the data. You can't assume safely that there is no other copy of that data out there. So that's got security implications. Hopefully it won't be copied and used on elsewhere, but you have to change your security protocols on the assumption that someone else has still got a copy of it. So there's a whole different variety of security insurance that provides different things. Some companies will provide a specialist service in the event of you being hit with a ransomware or an extortion, in terms of a negotiation service potentially with the bad guys. Again, I'm not going to comment on the success or otherwise of those. but there's a whole range of different services, some clearly better than others. But I think my general message is, cybersecurity insurance is certainly something you should be considering. Again, you're going to get what you pay for, as with any service. There's very good services and there's not so good services, but in general, anything that helps to give you a level of support and security has to be a good thing. I will pause there. Dan, I don't know if you want to take one of the other questions.
Sure. So I'm just mirroring what you've just said on the insurance question. I think don't just get cyber insurance and at the expense of anything else. It's just part of the picture. And I think that as we've all changed, so has the insurance that we're all looking at in terms of cyber. So if you already have cyber insurance, how's that affected by 4,000 of your employees working from home and things like that? Things to definitely consider, but that's an industry that's facing the same challenges we all are around these things. I'll just pick one of the other ones out, and it's the culture question. So how to make the web-based systems we currently use integrity proof and promote a culture where prevention is stronger than the audit checks or investigation after the event. I think we've all got to look at that it's often happens at a glacial pace, both in the public sector and in big corporate companies, and it starts with two things, I suppose. It starts with the leadership of the organisation. We've talked for many years about cybersecurity on the boardroom and what that means. I think that's a place that's a space that's improving now. I think boards don't no longer see it as just a cyber risk, but cyber's an enabler of the entire business. Good cybersecurity, you're going to see a return on that in the long term. And then the people, it comes back to people and that awareness piece that I was talking about earlier. If people understand the cyber risks, they're going to be more kind of nimble in kind of counteracting them, both professionally and in their personal lives. In terms of the kind of integrity proof, to a certain extent, you're never going to get something that's 100%. There's always going to be attacks. So you've got to get everything up to a certain level to be prepared, and the key word there, I suppose, is resilient to it. Being resilient in what your people are doing, in what tech you've got, and in the processes. The process is really important, especially for the largest companies.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I'll pick up on another question that's come in, and this is talking about employees who might be outside the UK. So there's a number of potential impacts here. I'm of the many things that I am not. I'm certainly not an employment lawyer, and I'm not so qualified to advise on some of the issues there. But I think there's a general point I can make around remote working and people working outside of the UK with cybersecurity in mind, and that is that one of the things we've noticed from an incident response perspective during lockdown is that a lot of companies were reliant, and they had they outsourced or they had a lot of their IT support, whether it's in-house or third party. A lot of that was overseas. So when something happened, and it happened in the UK, it actually got physically a whole lot harder for anybody to respond. If you're reliant on your incident response coming from another country, well, travel restrictions and so on there, it's not a cyber issue. It's just a simple physical logistical issue. People can't get to your organisation to do what they need to do. So we are seeing a general shift in a number of organisations looking to revisit their the managed service providers, and whether they bring a whole bunch of SOC functions in-house again, rather than having them overseas. But we've certainly seen a negative impact in terms of being able to appropriately cope with incident response, because people simply can't get there. It wouldn't necessarily have been something that we thought about beforehand, but it's something we've observed. Just looking at other questions that we've had come in. Had a question just now from a member of the audience around Zoom. What do you think about the Zoom platform? Is it secure enough? Well, okay, so I'll give a view on this, and Dan might want to come in as well. Yeah, I will need to be quite careful here, conscious that I do work for the government, as many of you do, and we can't seem to be promoting or denigrating any particular product. Zoom has had a lot of good press and quite a lot of bad press as well that everyone will have seen. And internally in the NCA, I'm happy to share that we use, as I said earlier, we've been heavy users of Zoom, and it's been a bit of a lifesaver, to be honest, in terms of keeping in touch with staff and enabling some workflow to carry on for various reasons on our IT platform. Other options aren't open to us, like Teams, for example, we can't use. Just because of the platform we use and the way our things are configured. So Zoom has been quite a good option. Is it secure enough? Well, there's a you can pick whichever press report you want to believe around where the infrastructure is actually based and what the level of foreign involvement might be. I'm not going to comment further on that. What I would say is that before we were using Zoom, our standard default was a telephone conference call, which is over an open unencrypted phone line. What would you rather do? Have a one-time passcode for an end-to-end encrypted video service, or an open phone line? I know what I'd do. I know what I'd prefer. So that's not me endorsing or otherwise Zoom as a product, but I do fear that they're perhaps slightly over maligned in terms of security implications, and I don't think there's much to choose between them and any number of other similar platforms that are around. Dan, I don't know if you've got a view on that from your tech perspective.
Well, yeah, I mean, we did an event last week with NCSC, and that were on Zoom as well. So I think that the kind of worry about using the platforms quite often misplaced. Obviously, there's platforms that you use for public domain stuff like this, and Zoom's great for that. It's great for big audiences, and I'm sure that within government and stuff, there's other ways that you're getting around the kind of classification issues, and that's probably not going on in the same way. In terms of the Zoom point more broadly, I think Zoom obviously have done a lot of work since the kind of start of the pandemic to improve their systems, and when we've seen that on all the platforms, right? So they've all started to look a lot more similar. You can raise your hand on them all now. That were originally a Zoom thing. So we've seen them come a long way in a really short space of time. And I think using them as well, people have got to be careful about how they're doing that, because obviously you're taking Zoom into your own home, and there's a kind of merge between your public and professional life, whether that's through BYOD or whatever it is. So I think it lands on people to be responsible in what they're doing as well. What they're sharing, what people can see on the webcams from on a simple level, but also what you're doing on your work computer in terms of personal emails and stuff like that. So it's quite complex, but yeah, I don't think it's really about just one company. It's about how the tech sector as a whole has really enabled us to work from home. Without Zoom and Teams, where would we be? We'd be on 50-person teleconference calls, and that's not where anyone wants to be, I don't think. So yeah, I think on the whole, the video conferencing stuff's been great. I think it's really kind of helped a lot of organisations who are now thinking about how they'll move this forward into the office as well. I think my organisation were one that were quite feeble in the way that we're using video conferencing before, but we're not going to go back to that, which I think is a great thing. I'll pick out another one.
Whilst you're doing that, Dan, I'll just add one other thing to Zoom. You made a really good point there around the platforms looking similar now and so on. I actually think from a security perspective, a lot of the bad press that Zoom had at the start was probably unfortunate because they were successful at the start, and a lot of people rushed to it. But actually, a lot of the issues that appeared in the media, you could substitute any company or platform name for Zoom, and it would have been the same issue. A lot of the things that were being published was as credentials being compromised and so on. Well, that's because a lot of people simply they didn't follow basic principles, and when they're setting up their Zoom account, they're using their default password that they use for everything else at all, and it's been compromised multiple times, and therefore you're not thinking about security, and they're using the same meeting code each time. So with a couple of really basic steps, using a one-time password, using one-time meeting codes, and so on, a couple of really basic steps, you can massively improve the security just by the way you use it, and that's without touching whatever sits behind the whatever sits in the back end of the platform. It's just the way that users use it. I'd say that could have been any other company that was experiencing that badness, but it's actually a user error more than the platform itself.
Just picking up on someone's commented on question around Zoom as well, saying that their employers told them not to use it for meetings and to use Microsoft Teams instead. That's something that we've seen lots of, whether it's not a case of using one over the others, it's just people have preferences. So we've seen people prefer Teams and only do meetings on Teams. We've seen some government departments really like Google, some use that almost exclusively. But I think especially in industry anyway, I think you've got to be quite nimble and flexible and use whichever one, the people you want to get hold of are using. I think I've used about 7 or 8 now on Amazon Chime the other day. So I think, it's just it's a case of personal preference rather than one's more secure than the other, I'd suggest, although I'm sure the people that run them would say that theirs is more secure, I'm sure. Just on one of the other questions that's come through, and please do carry on putting in the Q&A, we're checking that as well. SMEs are the most vulnerable due to lack of expertise and funding. What can be done to help them? This is a really important point, and I think Mike's already touched on it a little bit. We did some work looking at how charities are coping. And the kind of sharpest, sometimes the sharpest cyber talent kind of drains from their organisation upwards into companies that can afford to pay the bigger salaries you'd expect. And I think that SMEs have got to be clever in where they're going for advice. You do a great deal in kind of publishing guidance and helping direct people to the right place, and you've got to find people that you get a good gut feel about. It's like buying anything. If you're looking at cybersecurity tools and technologies, that it's about that relationship that you go on, and if people are offering you a silver bullet, that's a big red flag. It's rubbish. Then you've got to kind of do your own due diligence, whether that's through the kind of various online platforms or looking at a company's background. You've got to seek out good partners, and I think that's the key for SMEs who maybe don't have that in-house capability that can do a lot of the heavy lifting. So yeah, direct people to the NCSC website. There's also a lot of long-standing great technology companies out there that have got great reputations in the sector, and it just takes a little bit of thinking about. I think that's the key. It's like there's a lot of marketing buzz, a lot of snake oil salesmen in the cyber sector, but there is ways to quickly filter that out, I think. Don't know if you want to come in on that one, Mike.
Yeah, take myself off mute there. Apologies. So yeah, absolutely, Dan. The best advice I could give is to point people towards the NCSC website. There's a lot of links on there and a lot of services which are free, and a lot of advice for everybody. I think it's a challenge that SMEs have. You decide to set up your own business because you're very good at whatever it is you're very good at, and you can make some money out of it, you think. But what you're, unless you are actually an IT business, or you're not expected to, you'd be unrealistic for you to expect to do all of your own information security as well. But there is quite a lot of stuff out there which is free, and as Dan says, beware of the silver bullet, because I've not found one that actually exists yet. So there will be Ian Levy from NCSC will often say there's a lot of companies out there peddling snake oil. Again, that's not him denigrating the whole industry. It's making that's just a commentary on vendors sometimes making unrealistic promises. So be careful what it is that you're actually using. But with the really basic steps, there's an awful lot that can be done. There are some statistics around which I can't share on this platform, but we've done some interesting research around your general expectations of big multinational company. You would expect it to have a hefty level of cybersecurity, and if it does get breached, well, it must be quite a complex and high-tech organisation that's managed to do that, versus an SME where you'd expect a lower level of security, and if it's breached, it's probably something quite simple. Yeah, actually, that's not always the case. There's sometimes the large organisations that do have that big budget and do have access to an awful lot of resource. Sometimes they're breached by really basic, simple simple errors. The organisation has grown too quickly. Cyber has been that sort of pesky IT thing in the corner. It's not really had the board's attention. They're more focused on the mergers and acquisitions and growing the company and impressing the shareholders, which is fabulous right up until the point where something goes wrong, and only if they paid a bit more attention in cyber in the first place. So not in every case by any means, but it is a surprisingly large number of breaches of really big companies have happened through something really, really basic. A lot of that, I'm afraid, is not just systems. It's the human factor. The employees not being trained properly. We expect everybody to use computers, don't we? Whether that's in the office or remotely. But how many of us ever actually have some proper training from your organisation on the real basics, what to do? Human nature sometimes is that if there's a security control in place or something that tells me I can't do this, your automatic assumption is to see how we can get around this. That's the nature of the beast sometimes. But so yeah, it's SMEs are vulnerable because of the size of the organisation and the general lack of skill. But that doesn't have to be a disaster story, because there's a lot of stuff out there for free. Okay, Dan, I don't know if you want to pick up the next one. We've had a question on remote desktop services and VPNs.
So I'm not deeply technical myself, but I'll just kind of comment more broadly. I don't know if you can comment on the technicals a little bit, Mike. We've seen a massive rise in VPN use specifically. For many reasons. There's loads of reasons why people use VPNs. They're probably the one that the more and more different offerings. And I think again, it's a bit being that intelligent customer's the message. If you're getting a VPN and it's free, then why is it free? Where are they making money? What's the kind of business model that they're following? I'm not saying free is bad. I'm just saying that it's unlikely. It's about looking at the solution, looking at the specific technology or specific product, and saying, what is this? What is the purpose of this? Why should I get it? And what are the kind of security risks on the other side? VPNs sometimes
Sorry, Dan, you were breaking up a little bit there. I'm not sure I didn't catch everything. I didn't catch everything you were saying, but I'll come in with a little bit. Apologies if I'm repeating what you said around the VPN stuff, but just a fairly non-technical answer from me, I'm afraid. But yeah, VPNs can be massively useful for organisations, as can the use of RDP and so on. But they bring independent and different security risks. For VPNs, there's the clear risk for me is how you're actually accessing that. So again, we're reliant on people using in general. We're talking about home routers. How secure are they? Are the routers themselves vulnerable to compromise because people have never reset the default passwords? What type of router is being used? I mentioned earlier as well, again, slightly away from the VPN thing itself, but just more on that human factor. We've had some kind of managerial challenges, I guess, with people working remotely. For some people, just simply don't have the space or the setup at home for that to be a viable option. And so, when we've said to some staff, you need to work remotely, for them, if they're if they're fairly young, they're in a house share, for example, that actually means, well, stay in your bedroom all day long, which isn't that attractive. So, we're now finding that now people can go out and about a little bit more. Well, they might go and sit in Starbucks or and do their remote working. That's fine if they're still using they're still logging on to our VPN, but they're probably doing that using the free Wi-Fi from Starbucks, and your connection between that and the capture service is probably an insecure connection, so there's a vulnerability there. So you could be exposing credentials. It's not just working at home; it's remote working, and that's not always it's not always the same thing, and it does bring security risks. So in general, it's a bit of a godsend for organisations. I will say despite being the NCA, sometimes we do lag behind in quite a few ways in terms of IT, surprisingly. But we introduced a pretty good VPN system a couple of years back now, which was a bit of a game changer in terms of people being able to access things remotely and work remotely. The work we had to do back in March was to increase the size of that. We went from an average of maybe 500 to 1,000 people using that VPN each day to having 5,000 people working remotely. So we've had to increase the capacity of that system. And it's been fairly stable ever since, but the basic security has been in place ever since, and that's been a good thing. Just see if we've got any other questions have come in.
Just on that, Mike, actually, I've got a quick question. So I think public sector often gets a lot of stick for kind of implementing technologies and kind of moving to the latest technologies and adopting them. But we've seen in the last 3 months, enforced obviously because we've had to, but we've seen government move really quickly to everyone working from home. Do you think that what's the kind of, without going into too much detail, what's the kind of NCA plan for the future? Will you be going to a hybrid model as well? I think that's where my organisation's headed.
I think that's quite likely. I know there are there's public sector challenges all over at the moment, where I think there's a lot of traditional thinking where the sort of default response is I want to we should all be back in the office and let's try and be back where we were before March. I have to say I've been pleasantly surprised by that there's certain bits that we do that obviously can't be done remotely because of the classification or the equipment that's needed to do it and so on. That's not just something you can do off your laptop. So we've had a constant element of what we do has had to be office based, and in some cases that's been sort of challenging as to how we can do that in a COVID secure way. But by and large we've managed it. I think some of the challenge we're going to have now is a bit of a generational stroke cultural challenge where for a lot of a lot of the older generations, if I might put it that way, and I include myself amongst that, we've always been used to going to a place of work. It's just what you do. You go in there, you log on your computer in the morning, and then you do your day's work. Actually, the vast majority of my days are full up with meetings, and I'm finding that I can do most of that remotely. So could I save myself some commuting time and so on? Whereas I think some of our younger generations are a bit more used to the flexible concept, and they're certainly more used to the IT. And I think we'll have a bit of organisations are going to have a bit of a challenge now in working out how much really needs to be on premise, and how much we really need for people to physically be in, and how much we can accommodate that remote and hybrid working model, with all the security implications that brings. I do think that we're obviously all aware of the potential and the ongoing brain drain from public sector to private sector, because generally speaking the salaries are going to be higher. I can see that being another, in addition to salary considerations, I can see the ability to work remotely or flexibly, that in itself being a bit of a carrot that private sector organisations would increasingly offer to try and entice people away. And I think we need to be smart from a leadership perspective in the public sector to make sure that we can at least keep pace with that. We probably can't do on the salary side, but we can probably think a bit more intelligently around how we adapt in the future. Certainly, we've done a bit of an internal debriefing exercise just in the NCCU as to how we've coped. And we've received some really interesting feedback from staff, but one of the most resounding bits is that people like working remotely, and having that sort of blended ability to do a little bit in the office and a little bit remotely is probably good for people's well-being. If we can manage the security and manage the business continuity, I think it's a good thing. So I think our challenge is to be designing something which works for all. It meets individuals' needs, continues to meet the organisation's needs, but doesn't expose us to unnecessary security risk at the same time.
I think we're seeing a similar thing. I think a lot of it's going to be around choice. I'm keen to go back to office, but I live in relatively central to London, and I'm not sure I'd be feeling the same if I were commuting for an hour and a half every day. So I think there's lots of reasons why we'll go back to the office in some way, I think, but not in the same way. Kind of leads us on to, I think, the last question that we've not touched on yet, and it's probably one that I've not got a good answer to. It's all about printing and how printing works with the new ways of working. This is a challenge that I've actually faced in the last couple of weeks. For the first time, someone wanted me to sign something. Sign it on with wet ink on paper, not on like Adobe or whatever. And I think that's just another example of one of the things that people are going. We're already getting workarounds to that, and I think you'll see more kind of authentication stuff through digital means. I think that's coming. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if you want to touch on that one, Mike, but I think it might be one that we'll have to follow up with after to get a decent answer on it.
Yeah, I've not got much to add to that, I'm afraid, Dan. For me, it's back to information security basics. So we've already got, by working remotely, we've already got some of our IT assets out of the office, which increases the risk. How do we secure those? What instructions or guidance or facilities do we give to our staff to keep IT assets secure back at home? The answer is we probably don't. And we can do certain things like disabling removable media, that kind of thing, to try and reduce the risk. But printing is one of the things which at the moment, as I think the question says, is sort of default is outlawed. I think that's right. It's going to bring risks. Generally speaking, it's not going to be a networked printer that's provided by the organisation. It will be staff, individual staff members who want to use their own wireless printer they've got at home because it's really easy, isn't it? Well, again, we've got to think about the security implications of that. Yeah, who else might have access to that printer? How do we secure the paper that's printed off of it, whatever that is? But back to basics, really. Why do we actually need to print something? Yeah, I'm sure there are going to be circumstances where a paper copy of something is the only option. But as Dan rightly says, the idea of having a wet ink signature on everything is perhaps not as strong as it used to be, and there are an increasing number of digital authentication systems there which will do the same trick. So that's not a very technical answer, I'm afraid, but there's a lot of printers out there which are relatively cheap. So generally speaking, they don't have a high degree of security built into them, albeit they've got an IP address and they're accessible. So that's it's another way in for the bad guys. So the more things you connect to your corporate network in one way or another, the potentially higher the risk is. So we need to think carefully about it. But actually, in the first circumstance, my question would be, what is the actual business need? I'm sure a number of people will say there's a lot of circumstances where it's needed, but I quite enjoy not having being surrounded by paper most of the time, to be honest.
I think we've covered the questions in the chat, and I think we're running out of time, so it might be the time to hand back over to Antonia, unless anyone's got any final questions.
I think I will jump in there and just basically thank everyone for listening, and thank you to you, Dan and Mike, for participating. Thank you so much. Just before we head off, I know we had some issues with connections. We're going to put together a transcript of this, and we've also got a recording of this webinar, which will be made available to you at some point next week. So you will all be emailed this. Just a reminder, we do have the Cybersecurity Summit. We will be joined by NCSC, techUK, HMRC, DWP, you name it. So it's going to be very, very interesting, very lively, and it would be great to see you all there to continue this discussion. And if you're not already booked on, we've got a special discount for you all. So just for attending this webinar, you've got a 15% discount. So please do let us know, and we'll be in touch separately. So thank you all again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day, and see you on the 19th of November, hopefully.
Thanks very much, everybody. Bye-bye.